The eyes are possibly one of the most real aspects of connection between two sentient beings. When I'm talking to a self-identified Hindu right-wing cow vigilante, when I look into their eyes, though, therein allows a window of an opportunity of connection. And I've been thinking about why a calf's cry is so demands attention. The way an infant's cry is meant to demand attention. No one asked me if this was okay as a consumer. No one asked me. This is not, not in my name. This could not go on in my name. Hinduism does endorse that all living beings are divine. There is no exemption. Now, this does become very difficult in the current political climate, which is actually mobilizing the sacrality of an animal to its ends. I've heard so many people say Indian dairy farming is exemplar because the idea of cows as sacred or cow as mother sounds nice. But the reality always shows something different. So this puzzle about how does India become the largest beef producer in the world, a country where about 25 states have a ban on cow slaughter. India's constitution, I think, is one of the first in the world again to state that every Indian citizen has a fundamental duty to be compassionate. Whether these modes of thinking can find their way into ways that translate into the political economy, I would very much like to think that yes, it would. We don't have a Nelson Mandela. We don't have a Mahatma Gandhi. We don't have a Martin Luther King for animals.
Are you available, by the way? Good evening, Yamini. How are you?
Thank you, Jamie. Good evening to you too, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're spanning the globe again. So it's a morning in a sunny London and evening where you are, but the technology seems to be working. So it's great to have the chance to talk to you. I've really enjoyed reading at least excerpts so far from your book, Mother Cow, Mother India, and it was absolutely fascinating. So it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you about it and your wider work as well. So thanks for joining me on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about my book. I think this is the first conversation that I'm having on a podcast about Mother Cow, Mother India, because it was released just about a month ago. So it's a baby book, and you're the first conversation that I'm having about it.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's an honor to be the first, hopefully first of many. Yeah. So as we had the chance to chat a few days ago briefly as well. So as you know, this is a series of conversations. Of course, your book fits beautifully into this. But it's a series of conversations ultimately about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions. What's real and how should we understand the universe, and what exists and what doesn't, and how should we form those beliefs, questions of epistemology, but also just as importantly, the questions of ethics, who matters and what matters, and so on and so forth. And I have an obvious bias in how to answer those because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really pluralistic, simple worldview I'm calling Sentientism, which in a sentence is, let's use evidence, reason, and have compassion for all sentient beings. So it suggests we answer the what's real question with quite a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to the ethical question, it's quite ethically pluralistic. It doesn't tell us what system to use, but it says whatever ethical approach you use, every sentient being has to matter. Every being that can experience things, particularly can suffer, can flourish. But I'm talking in these conversations to people whether or not they disagree with that worldview. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own sort of personal philosophical journey and how that plays into your work and your book. But before we get onto those big, crazy questions, how would you best introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jamie. My name is Yamini Narayanan. I'm an associate professor of international development at Deakin University in Melbourne. My research for a long time focused on gender-sensitive urban development, and it was entirely by mistake, a very fortuitous mistake, because my research was supposed to be focusing on a very, very specific aspect of women-sensitive urban transportation in the city of New Delhi, which has a very high rape rate against women. So it was a very specific project that I was actually working on when a twist of events suddenly led me to the world of animals. And for the last 10 years, I think I really did a roundabout turn, and I started to focus on animals and urban planning as a start. And then, of course, it kind of transposed and transpired into animals and national politics in India. So that has been my work in the last few years, especially focusing very specifically on animals and various forms of identity politics and nationalistic politics in India.
Yeah, Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And we'll dig into some of those themes as we work through. So let's start with the first of these big philosophical questions: what's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a more religious or a supernatural or a mystical sort of family and society and context and had those sorts of beliefs, or one that was more naturalistic, scientifically minded, maybe atheist agnostic, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time. And, religion isn't the only question, of course, when you're thinking about naturalism and supernaturalism, but it's often the central one. But you can tell the story however you like about how your thinking started and how it's developed on that front.
How do I perceive what is real?
Yeah.
This has been such an interesting question because we're constantly questioned on what is, our conclusions, our observations, our empirical analysis about our work on animals. And when we present it, especially to an audience who is not familiar with animals, we're constantly questioned about how do you know that this is real? How do you read an expression of a cow? How do you read the mannerism of a cow? How do you ascribe these sorts of emotions? Or how do you ascribe even these sorts of politics to a particular cow or to cows as collectives or as species? So the question of what is real comes up constantly in various different forms in animal studies work in particular. It's a question that we have been challenged on, but it's also a question that we need to reflect on ourselves, because how much of projections and how much of biases and prejudices are we bringing into our conclusions, into our analysis, into our narratives, into our own politics? How much of it is self-serving? So we got to sort of reflect on these questions very closely ourselves as well.
Yeah, it's sort of foundational, isn't it? If you want to engage with the world in some way, you have to hold beliefs about it. So how you hold those beliefs and how you come to hold those beliefs and how and whether you challenge them is sort of inescapable, right? It's a really deep question, yeah.
Extremely deep questions. And in order for us to bring a lot of authenticity and integrity to this work and to do justice to the subjects of the work that we care about, both human and non-human beings that we care about, we actually got to be very carefully reflecting on this question of what is real all the time. And I really found your question, and despite thinking about it, your question again made me rethink and reflect on this. And I think this is probably the question that I've been thinking about the most in the lead up to our conversation today. What is real? So when I am in the field and when I am directly confronted by scenes of really visceral, extreme physical violence and suffering, okay, because that is what I get to see in the specific areas of animal work that I do, which is in the dairy farming. Currently, I'm working on animal labor in Indian bricklands. Even in the human case, the International Labor Organization calls the South Asian bricklands the most extreme working environment, which is almost a gentle way of putting what is actually out there. It's a brutal environment, right? It's one of the most extreme, brutal environments. They're talking about it in the case of humans who still have some very meager rights, but or some, the flimsiest of protections, virtually none in many cases. But in the case of animals, they are completely have been disregarded all this while as laboring subjects at all. Right. So the scenes that I see are constantly visceral and brutal. And in these kind of contexts, again, on the one hand, what is real is so obvious. So we think the fact of suffering, the fact of sentience, but it's also a question. It's also a question that we critical animal scholars constantly have between ourselves as well. And one of the ways that I thought I would enter into this understanding, into this discussion of what is real, is what do I choose to engage with when I view or when I witness an animal, right? And I've asked this question to a lot of other scholars as well, and they will, a lot of activist artist scholars will say things like, oh, the patterns of their fur, or the colors of their fur, or the colors of an animal's skin, the scales or the feathers. And these are things that an artist activist is naturally drawn to. For me, I think it has always been the eyes, right? The eyes of an animal. And even in my previous work on humans, for some reason, I always connect directly with the eyes. It is impossible to, in my view, to sustain any form of differentiation fundamentally when we look at the eyes, when we look at other body parts, when we look at other features, physical features. And then it's not to disregard those features or even the differences that these features suggest. But I find it almost difficult, impossible to differentiate in any significant or any meaningful way beyond literally noting any physical difference. I find it difficult to differentiate in any meaningful way when I see the eyes. And I think for me, the eyes are possibly one of the most real aspects of connection between two sentient beings, right? And it is impossible for me to see difference. It's impossible for me to see hierarchy when I look into the eyes. I think it's really difficult. And it is not just in the case of human to another non-human being, but even between humans. So when I'm talking to a butcher, when I'm talking to a self-identified Hindu right-wing cow vigilante, when I look into their eyes, though, right, it is again difficult for me to cancel or reject them completely as well. And I think therein allows a window of an opportunity of connection. So for me, the eyes are a pathway into something real, into something which is deeper than any superficial connection. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And you're demonstrating something that almost always happens in these conversations. It's really hard to separate the sort of what's real from the who matters thing, but that's a beautiful connection, because you sort of started to explain the answer to that later question about, how you use evidence and a real physical connection and a view into the eyes and an identification as a link into understanding the other. And it's so, in a sense, in doing that, you're using evidence, right? Because as you say, in your field work, you're out there, you're using your senses, you're looking, you're listening, you're hearing, you're feeling, you're smelling. So, that is a sort of broadly naturalistic approach, right? That I'd argue basically all humans take to some degree, and non-humans take as well. I sometimes argue that, before humanity even existed, non-human animals are in a sense taking a naturalistic approach. They're using their senses, they're trying to learn honestly about the world and using that to navigate. So I think that's fairly well-grounded. But you mentioned the sort of critical animal studies perspective, and obviously there's the broader sort of swathe of academic approaches that take a critical approach. And one of the things that I understand is really central to that idea is quite a heavy weight on the subjective, if that makes sense. So it's understanding different perspectives and valuing those perspectives and recognizing and not being too quick to jump to this view that there is one single objective reality, there's a total ultimate truth, and according weight to subjective views of that, different views of that. Is that fair to say that's a theme in critical studies?
Absolutely. And not just acknowledging that there are variations in subjective views between us as scholars or between us as humans, but also amongst animals themselves, amongst collectives of animals themselves. They have subjective views of us. They have subjective reactions to us. They have differentiated reactions to us.
Any being with a perspective, yeah.
Any being with a perspective, and they react in such deeply individualistic ways. And when I'm in a fieldwork situation, I'm talking about a dairy farm here. Now, in an Indian dairy farm, animals are heavily restrained and constrained, right? They are almost like concentrated animal feeding operations of the West. So they're chained, they're tied, and they remain that way for nearly 24 hours, almost continuously. So we're walking into a situation where they are absolutely unable to exhibit no natural behavior virtually. Cows can't even turn their heads around to scratch themselves because they're tied with face harnesses so tightly, but on very, very short leashes. This is something I talk about repeatedly in my book. Even when they're tied, they're such tight leashes, such tight chains that they can't move. So you're walking into a situation where there is very limited avenue for all these individuals to express individual behavior, or so you would think, and yet they manage, right? There are cows who express curiosity in me. They want my attention sometimes. They are repulsed by my attention sometimes, right? They are, the way that I would read them, and I talk about this in my book as well, they're impatient. They have reached a point where they're almost tired of futile gestures from humans. Like, if I scratch them or if I try to pet them, they don't even want that anymore. They probably never wanted that, but there is such a spectrum of reactions, right? There's such a wide spectrum of reactions. So I think it is really important for me to hold all those collective responses, diverse responses, contradictory responses that I don't understand, responses that sometimes shame me, so I want to actually distance myself from them. But I shouldn't, and I try not to, and I'm in fact more mindful of holding in mind and holding and holding and giving space to those responses of cows that actually bring shame in me, right? For what it suggests about myself, either as an individual or as a human being. So I think it's really important to sort of hold these sorts of collective, subjective, diverse responses, not just of us as human beings, but with the whole, bearing in mind that these realities and this variety of experiences exist for other beings as well that we work with, sometimes very closely.
And sometimes there's a caricature made of the critical animal studies or the critical studies world, and the caricature is roughly that you're taking the subjective, so you're putting so much weight on the subjective that you're almost denying there is an objective shared reality. And there can, the caricatures would be of people talking about their own lived experience or their own truths as if they're independent from reality as a whole, and almost the implication that they might even be arbitrary, right? I can just choose to believe anything I like, and there's nothing you can or should say to ever challenge that because it's my own truth. And I think there's a degree to which that's often just a caricature. But I guess the way I try to reconcile it is that, again, we're coming to touch on the ethical topic in a bit as well, but in a way, the central idea of sentientism is that the sentience, the experiences of the other, are the absolute grounding of ethical concern and ultimately, in my view, all value, right? So in that sense, my perspective, which is a very sort of boring, naturalistic, scientifically minded, quite hard-edged epistemology, is totally focused in value terms on the experiences of the other. So I take the subjective, is foundationally important in everything of value. But at the same time, I do think that each of those subjective beings, and even their subjective perspective, which I think of as patterns of information processing going on in their brains and their nervous systems, those subjective beings themselves are objective parts of a shared reality that do probably exist out there, and that we all do share one reality. And what that means to me is that I think it's ultimately a hopeful message, because we can take the subjective viewpoints of others very seriously, because I do think we probably all share one objective reality, and each of those subjects are part of the objective reality. That gives us a chance to learn about things together and develop common ground and understand each other. And, we're not just completely isolated islands floating in a galaxy, right? We do ultimately share one objective reality. So that's my sense of how I try and put, lots of weight on the subjective, but still recognize that there's only really one truth, and we're all scrabbling to understand it, and we all share one reality. But I don't know how you think about that.
That's a great question, because this charge of emotionalism, especially, is something that dairy researchers in particular face, I think.
Yeah, it links to the sort of intellectual versus emotional thing as well, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's right, because one of the things that dairy researchers constantly bring to light is the separation of the mother and the infant, and the lived realities and the suffering and the visceral suffering that both the mother and the infant experience as a result, and the words that are used, the way that these realities are described. The very fact of suffering as a result of the separation of mother and child, which is held to be one of the most important relationships in intrahuman relationships, right? So this separation, when we talk about it, is, it's so uncomfortable that I think the charges of emotionalism come to front very quickly. One of the ways in which I tried to sort of circumnavigate this particular type of chart is because, on the face of it, when you're seeing it in a farm, it is undeniable. I mean, that's the way the cows strain, the way the calves. Oh my God, I did not know until I started this research about how loud and how charged a calf's bleating for its mother can be. It's repeated. I think that's the one sound that I've never been able to get used to. Not even the cow's cries, but so much as the calf's cries. I think, and I've been thinking about why a calf's cry is so viscerally loud and charged, and it is not possible. I mean, I think the very nature of its cries it demands attention. The way an infant's cries is meant to demand attention, right? It's not just the mother, or the rest of us are kind of pulled to the calf's cry as well. And I think it's because, in a natural herd, in a free roaming forest herd, if a calf fell away from the herd, the calf had to find a way of somehow making himself or herself heard, right? And I think it was really loud, and the mother could find her way back to her, her calf. So it's a really loud sound. Something I've never been able to get used to, but when I started to look at, more objective forms of research, well, fine, if, critical animal researchers are emotional or are anthropomorphizing too much, if these are the kind of charges that are laid, how do dairy scientists talk about it? How do veterinary scientists talk about it? How do animal welfare scientists talk about it, right? So I started to look at all their journal research, and I started to draw on their work as well. So they would talk about the cow expresses discomfort, which is a very neutralized language as compared to, how we might talk about it in more vivid terms or in more descriptive terms. But they would talk about how cow expresses discomfort at the separate, and it particularly peaks if the separation has been, if the cow and the calf have been allowed to stay together for, let's say, a week or 2 days or even 2 weeks sometimes, and then separated, then the cow's discomfort escalates or elevates. So, and then you probe about what does it mean for a cow to be experiencing discomfort? And then they will talk about how, she's exhibiting restless behavior, or she's sniffing at the gate repeatedly. She's charging around at the gate repeatedly because she knows that the gate is the very thing that is keeping her away from the calf. So what I'm saying is that they kind of tend to describe these things in more observational terms, right? Whereas I think what critical animal studies has now started to describe these acts of observation as witnessing, because there's something more political about witnessing. Right? Observation is somewhat of a more depoliticized term now. It's not to say, I think traditional anthropologists will still insist that observation is political, because we are looking at, especially, we are looking at lived realities of people, and that always is inherently a political act. So I think traditional anthropologists will insist that observation continues to be political.
And it can be a tool against oppression and as a tool of resistance by grounding things in facts and using that as an evidence base as well.
Absolutely. So for all of these reasons, observation is political, but the reality is that scientists in laboratories who use animals will also talk about observing animals. Their engagement, their methodology is also observation. Right. So there is always a risk. So I think animal studies scholars, especially those of a critical political bent, talk instead about witnessing. And how is observation then different from witnessing? Right. Witnessing is more charged, more political. Witnessing is inherently demands advocacy. It demands response, the way observation doesn't necessarily demand a political response. But witnessing demands a political response, whether it is in terms of advocacy, whether it's in terms of writing about it, whether it is, sometimes it is, to the very empirical, very pragmatic situation of litigation. That's something which I think inevitably kind of goes together in fieldwork contexts where you are able to do that. As an Indian citizen, I will often invoke the Right to Information Act, for example, right? So these are also avenues of trying to react. It's not to say that these are not possible in an observational situation, but I think witnessing demands more advocacy and a more of a political response than observation might.
And do you think the reason why witnessing demands that political response is because it has a richer sense of identification with the perspective of the other, whereas an observational stance, almost by definition, is standing back and looking from the outside, whereas a witnessing is at least attempting to stand in the shoes of the other or in the hooves of the other, and that's where the charge comes from. That's where the imperative comes from, because you're sort of trying to feel what they feel, or am I?
You put that perfectly, actually. So when in an observational situation, I'm still exercising control.
Yeah.
In a witnessing situation, I am
And there's
surrendering
detachment.
some control. You know, I am allowing myself a greater degree of vulnerability. This is not to say that as a human witness, you're surrendering control altogether. That is inherently impossible, I think. But in a observational situation, you have full control. You have control in a witnessing situation as well. But I think it's a question of the degrees of vulnerability of the researcher. I think it's important for a researcher to be vulnerable in order to be political. In order to allow oneself to be political, I have to allow myself to be vulnerable. And it's really interesting because sometimes and this is where I think one has to be very careful also, though, about human narcissism and human ego coming in the way. Sometimes I will witness something, right? And it's an act of, and it may not be an act of extreme violence, like physical violence in that moment. It is, I remember in my last field trip, there was 11 donkeys in a informal slaughterhouse, and they were, going to be slaughtered the next day. 11 donkeys, 11 male donkeys, each of them were tied up, hobbled quite intensively, so they couldn't really move. And despite not being able to move, again, you could see different reactions to my presence, which was a strange presence. But there was one donkey in particular in the far right corner who had nothing, who was so broken. I don't know in the moment of actual slaughter what his reaction might have been, but in that moment, he had nothing. He was broken. Whether I was there, not there, whether I was taking photos, whether I was walking around, whether I was trying to, he had absolutely nothing. He was broken. He was completely broken, right? So what I'm saying with witnessing, with the level of, and when I think about that donkey, that broken donkey, especially much later, sometimes I feel like my pain is almost so visceral and physical that I feel like I'm the pain body. And that's when I think, got to be so careful about my ego and my sense of narcissism.
Because you're not experiencing that.
I am not experiencing that, right? I am not experiencing that. So I think with even witnessing, one has to be very careful about not deluding oneself that though you have so much empathy for that pain, and that is why I think a lot of critical animal researchers who do active fieldwork, they do legitimately experience a lot of post-traumatic stress. It is not to take that away. I've experienced that myself, but we're still not experiencing, the pain body. When I think about the pain body, I almost think that I sometimes feel, and I know that that's some egoistic narcissism that's thinking that I can almost feel what the donkey is feeling, which is so not true, which is so beyond not true. So I think we got to be very careful in witnessing as well about how far we take that sense of empathy. It is true that what differentiates observation from witnessing might be a greater degree of empathy. It's not to say that observation is devoid of empathy, but I think witnessing is founded upon empathy. Observation is not necessarily founded upon empathy at all. But how far we run with that empathy as well, we got to be very careful. We got to be very vigilant of our own sort of motivations and our own sense of narcissism there as well.
Yeah. You need that humility, and it seems to me that that's where the right answer lies is in that balance between if you only try to take an objective stance and you ignore the subjective, you've almost destroyed value or empathy or ethics in a sense. If you go purely, totally detached objectivity, there's that risk that you lose the value and the meaning and the connection and the politics.
Absolutely.
If you take a purely subjective stance but lose your connection to objectivity, that has plenty of its own risks as well. And to my mind, I just don't see there's an issue in using both sides. And I guess it comes back to the suggestion that the subjective is where the value is, but the subjective is part of our shared objective reality too. And I love the way you talked about that connection with the eyes, because sometimes, obviously when I'm talking about sentience, people will talk about, well, how do you assess sentience? And I quite often give quite a sort of objective scientific answer about lines of, inference. So I can talk about, we have a common evolutionary history with, for example, non-human animals, and you can understand the adaptive context and that gives us some evidence that they might experience things the same way we do. We could look at their behavior and communications and infer from that, you know, it's likely that those things are being driven because they have a subjective perspective and they are sentient beings. You could look at the way they process information and the commonalities in nervous systems and say, look, they seem to be processing information in similar ways, you know, with senses and reactions and so on. So you could do all of that scientific stuff and say, look, therefore I'm pretty confident that you're sentient. I'm pretty confident that the puppy behind me here is sentient and so on. And so you can do all that sort of scientific, naturalistic, objective stuff. But firstly, even that inference is grounded ultimately in my own subjective experience, right? That's the thing I'm linking from. I'm saying, well, I'm conscious, I'm sentient. Now here's the inference from that. So even that line of thinking still uses my subjective positioning as a starting point. But you can also bypass all that crap and just look into the eyes of a cow or a puppy, or as you said, and your brain is emotionally and intuitively making that same connection. And they're not distinct things, right? They are because of each other, and they are ultimately the same phenomenon. I think we're just experiencing different ways, you know. So I do think there is a sort of a resolution and an integration of, you know, the objective and the subjective, and how we see both of them ultimately are aspects of the same shared reality.
You are absolutely right about how we sort of, you know, constantly interchange between the subjective and the objective. We may not necessarily frame it in those ways, but I think that is exactly the process by which we try and make sense of the world. One of the ways in which I have been trying to grapple with to what extent, you know, the subjective objective realities have shaped my politics is in the context of this rapidly changing political landscape in India, where, you know, India's secularism is being disintegrated and killed before our very eyes, and you know, being replaced by this very authoritarian right-wing model. And it is really interesting for those of us who grew up in the 1980s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We grew up, I would like to think of it as we were raised in secularism. We were raised and birthed in the world of secularism, and it was really, I mean, there was no question of, you know, festivals were celebrated together, and all religions were celebrated, and certainly, I cannot honestly recall a single anti-Pakistan comment, rant, not even in passing. I can't recall it. I cannot recall it. There wasn't one. We weren't raised in that sort of model of social thinking or political thinking whatsoever. I must admit, we weren't necessarily as anti-casteist as I would have liked us to be, looking back, right? I think we grew up in very privileged schools, and privileged schools are populated by very privileged caste people who are not necessarily going to question their privilege. But we didn't grow up with that sort of anti-caste as much as, you know, a secular upbringing, but I'm trying to think whether what sort of objective or subjective reality shaped our secularism that was taken for granted. We took that for granted. We never questioned it. We were certainly taught that in schools. We was, you know, India's constitution talks and proclaims secularism as one of the country's guiding principles. So we were taught that in very objective ways, but we also subjectively would have lived that in having holidays for all festivals. I think capitalism aided that as well, you know, in trying to sell all festivals equally.
Yeah,
so
everybody's rupees, you know, can buy stuff.
Everybody's rupees are equally valuable. That's right. Yeah. But I think it was not until I got into animal studies that, and that was a very, very subjective entry in. That was not an objective entry, and I did not think, oh, this would be a great career decision. Let me, you know, take a quick turn into animal studies. That was. You
didn't have a spreadsheet with pros and cons.
No. This was a fully emotional, subjective decision. Some people actually told me this is a career destroying decision. This is going to be a career unmaking decision. And this was 10 years ago. When animal studies was relatively nascent. Certainly in my very mainstream university structure, there was, you know, no one doing animal studies, and it might or might not have been true that this could not have been a career destroying decision, but there was no way, because I was so emotionally immersed in what I saw. And when I, you know, again, it was a PETA video that sort of, yeah, I mean, I know Peter's politics are very problematic, but it was anti-fur or anti-leather videos that I saw. And I couldn't believe, and I said, not in my name. No one asked if this was okay. No one asked me if this was okay as a consumer. No one asked me. This is not, not in my name. This could not go on in my name. And I made that decision to get into animal studies. But when I look into an animal's eyes, I look into my chicken's eyes, for example, we have rescue chickens in our home, and I look into their eyes. And as I said, it's impossible when you no longer see a difference between a chicken and myself. I genuinely cannot see a difference. No meaningful, significant difference. They have feathers, I have hands, but there is no meaningful, significant difference that I can see between a chicken and myself. Then any remaining vestiges of any difference that I might perceive between myself and a human being completely falls away.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is not grounded in objectivity, though. This is grounded completely in a subjective reality. But, there is no way that I cannot stick by it, because it is so, the feeling is so visceral. The feeling is so animalistic, and I trust my body feeling. My body's feelings is not a conclusion of rationalism. It is purely gut and feeling, right? Yeah. And that's what I choose to trust much more than I choose to trust my mind, which can tell me all sorts of stories.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you. And I'd still argue that I think it's strongly correlated with and flows from an objective reality. But I agree, but ultimately it's really the main thing that's driving who you are and what you value and how you think. Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. Now, what and we've already started talking about what matters and who matters, of course. But you talked about the ideas of secularism and religion, particularly in Indian society as well, and the way you were brought up, secularism was just assumed. And as most of my audience will probably know, secularism isn't a stance against religion. It's a stance of governance and government that says, well, government should be neutral about religion, and people of all faiths and none should be treated well and with respect and supported. So secularism isn't a commitment to not being religious. It's a commitment to being egalitarian and fair, regardless of religious faith at all. But I'm assuming your family were a Hindu family, and that was the context you grew up in. So again, that's a great example, right? It's a Hindu family that deeply invested in secularism. And that idea of religion is another fascinating one in this sort of what's real question, because that's one of the biggest questions when you're thinking about what's real. Is there a God? Is there a heaven and a hell? That type of stuff. If you're comfortable,
yes, of course.
I'm interested in your personal journey on that front as well. I mean, are you Hindu now? Do you hold those beliefs? Have things shifted at all for you on that front? Or
I love that question. Well, when I first came to Australia, lots of people asked me, are you a practicing Hindu? And I had no idea what that meant, because there is a distinction here between a Christian and a practicing Christian, right? So, a practicing Christian is differentiate from other Christians. And I was like, are you a practicing Hindu? I'd never heard of this concept of a practicing Hindu before. And it felt to me like, what's the next question? Am I a practicing woman, or am I a practicing Indian? What does it mean to be a practicing woman? What do I need to do? That's a scary question to sort of.
Where's the list of rituals?
Because for me, the idea of a practicing Hindu was a frightening one, because I thought it's actually making an identity normative. This is how you make an identity normative, right? Because the Hinduism that I sort of grew up with makes no such demands. I mean, you whether I go to a temple, whether I chant and pray, I don't do anything at all that could be remotely distinguished as a practicing Hindu. In recent years, when I've gone to temples, it's mostly to fight with priests about cow protection and the differences between, our views and how cows are objectified in Hinduism. So I guess, we grew up with a very egalitarian view of what it means even to be just a Hindu, leave alone what it means to be, what it means to be members of other religions. We had a very flexible, very egalitarian view personally growing up about what it means to be a Hindu. There was no expectations. There was no normative requirement about what it means to be a Hindu.
And as I understand it, that's one area where Hinduism is very different from the Abrahamic religions, right? It's much less sort of centralized or dogmatized or strict. It's not like, well, there's one God and here's the implication and here's the list of rules. It is much sort of, has been a much richer, sort of broader, pluralistic, maybe more messy sort of worldview than some of the other
not if you ask the Hindu right at the moment, they will tell you.
Well, that's the difference, yeah.
So political Hinduism obviously is very different from the more theological, philosophical genre of Hinduism. But Hinduism in its various sorts of genres does have a very long history of reflecting on the difference between illusion and reality. Right, Maya, which is illusion. What is illusion? What is reality? Hinduism has a very long history of trying to figure out what is how do we sort of discern reality from the Maya or from the illusion that basically constantly confronts us. And so we have this sort of intellectual tradition of, and how do you kind of practice that? How do you translate that into practice? And I think it is easy to sort of, again, this is something which most religions would be vulnerable to, is to sort of, when you can't stay with this question of what is real and what is Maya or what is illusion, I think when that becomes too difficult to sit with, I think dogmatism becomes the answer, right? To have very clear, very prescribed sorts of views on what it means. Hinduism's flexibility and, I don't know, generosity, or sometimes it also seems like a trap in letting us think about these things in philosophical ways. It also, allows us to sort of think about reality in action-oriented ways. It allows us to think about living our own lives in, we don't have to think about it in philosophical, meditative ways. We can actually, there's a karma yoga, which just talks about action-oriented life, a life of dharma, which is, action, which is basically based on justice and just action. But again, these are very, but there's again no prescription for how we sort of figure out what is just and what is ethical in these sorts of in a whole range of varied situations. Hinduism will tell us that reality is what is unchanging. And then illusions are constant, and there is one transcendental, unchanging reality. And in order to access that one transcendental, unchanging reality, we have to sort of go deeper into all sorts of mind consciousness, and for which, again, practicing Hinduism, if you will offer lots of pathways. Fasting is one way that people fast as a way of trying to sort of sharpen the focus into, non-sensory, non-physical modes of relating with the world, and trying to go deeper into another layer of subconsciousness. So there are lots of avenues, meditation, fasting, etc., that people might deploy. But the one fundamental aspect of Hinduism, which I do like and which I do trust in, because ultimately I think religion is about faith. Right? It is about taking a leap of faith, is that Hinduism does endorse that all living beings are divine. There's a sacrality, there's a divinity to all living beings, and there is no exemption. All human beings. We have a history of venerating plants. There's a history of tree worship in India, animal worship in India. Now, this does become very difficult in the current political climate, which is actually mobilizing the sacrality of an animal to its ends, but also for what it actually means for a sentient being. It's one thing to worship a tree, and it's one thing to worship a sentient cow, and it's one thing to worship a sentient human. Okay, now this is what actually concerns me, right? A few years ago, I was in Nepal, I was in Kathmandu, and one of the tourist attractions was a temple which had a young girl, where the goddess was a living goddess, a young girl. I think she was 10 years old or something. And we had gone there for an animal conference, actually, Animals for Asia, Asia for Animals conference. And there were a lot of us that thought, how is this even possible? We were so shocked, and we were so confronted by the reality of a young girl being worshipped, who was probably, I think, 6 years old or 8 years old. Because it's in India, it would be considered to be child abuse to take a young child and put them because through many years, until the girl reaches puberty, she's going to be worshipped. She's robbed of her childhood completely, right? It also messes with their minds to be worshipped for so long and then to be rejected as a regular human being. They have no sense necessarily of who they are, but they have an identity imposed on them. There's not just a politics of identity, which is, the identity that I present to the world. There's also a politics of identification, which means my identity relies on the identity that I impose on you. That's the politics of identification. Right? So what the cow experiences is a politics of identification, because I have imposed a particular identity on the cow that directly relates to my own identity. When I worship a young girl, I've imposed a particular identity on a young, vulnerable girl that directly comes back to framing my own identity. Right? And in my work, I argue that sacralization is a form of objectification as well. And any form of objectification is a form of violence, right?
It's an imposition. It's a classification that devalues in a sense. Yeah,
absolutely. Devalues in the name of potentially valuing, as you do with
that's the weird thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's as you do with the cow, for example, as you do with that young girl who was being worshipped.
Yeah.
Right? Child worship is actually would be treated, as I said, as an act of as a child rights violation. It still happens, I'm sure, in many parts of India, though we had been directly confronted with it in Nepal, another Hindu society, right? So that was my point. And Indian feminists have been talking for a long time. Indian sociological feminists have been talking for a long time about how one of the reasons for the oppressed status of women in India directly relates to their elevated status as goddess, as a mother, as a wife. Okay, at least the cow is not being treated as a wife, right? Or but in the case of women, they have an exalted status as a mother. The exalted status as a wife actually pins them down, right? So Martha Nussbaum talks about objectification, and she talks about the 7 ways in which objectification is a form of violence, fundamentally, except one, right? Except one, and this applies exclusively to human beings, where there is informed consent. Where I provide informed consent to be objectified a certain way, then there is autonomy. I'm more autonomous. I'm not fully objectified because I have provided informed consent. That's the only exception to objectification being violent. Otherwise, objectification is an act of violence. And sacralization is a form of objectification. Other animals do not have the capacity to provide informed consent. Right? So it becomes this act of violence as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you. And I do want to come back to that, because I think that's one of the central themes that will run through, as you tell us the story of your book too. And the question about religion and how we choose what to believe, and naturalism and so on, and as you said, that leap of faith, you laid out some really good examples of there and why I think they're important. So some people will say, look, this idea of whether you're religious or not, or whether you have supernatural beliefs or whether you have faith, it doesn't really matter too much, because it's just a personal thing that people have this view, and why does it affect anything else, right? It's just and in a way, I'm absolutely fine with that. I'm a strong believer in freedom of belief and that secular idea that you can believe what you like, as long as it doesn't become a justification for harming others. And the example with the young girl that you mentioned is a great example of, unfortunately, how that does work, because the reason those people are doing those things is because they hold beliefs in things that I think are completely unfounded in the evidence. They've taken a leap of faith, probably because of the way they were brought up, that leads them to genuinely believe certain things are true that I just don't think they are. But because those people believe those things, probably in a deeply faith-based dogmatic way,
yes,
what they are doing in their terms is ethical and correct. Because they've sacralized the young girl, and because she is the living instantiation of the God, and they are doing the right thing. And I guess the part of the reason I bang on about the evidence and reason and the naturalism is because if we have a shared commitment to evidence and reason, we could at least debate that and talk about, what's the evidence behind that, and is that well-founded belief, and we could try and find some way of engaging with reality with those people to talk about the experiences of this person and the harms being done. But if their belief is fideistic and faith-based and dogmatic, there's no real way to engage with that in a sense. So would you describe yourself as a Hindu today?
Yes.
Yeah. And as part of that, do you ascribe to any beliefs that I might think of as supernatural? or is it a more sort of naturalized, pluralistic, sort of cultural version of Hinduism, which I don't know. I don't know how to ask the question. But
Yeah.
do you see what I'm getting at?
That's a great. I don't think I've ever been asked this before.
Do you believe the gods exist? Do you believe that? Yeah.
I would absolutely call myself a Hindu. I would also call myself a devout Hindu. But virtually everybody from the Hindu right would disagree that I am a Hindu.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I would not, because I would be on such shaky grounds with questions like, is there a God? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Hinduism allows for atheism, agnosticism, rationalism. And I don't know. And it was just really interesting. This trip, after close to 20 years, I actually went to a temple as a devotee. I just had this urge and I went in pure faith and nothing else. But that has happened once in 20 years. It might be another 20 years before I visit a temple in the same spirit again. Do I believe in, cosmological sentience of the stars and the sun? I don't know again. And I'd rather than saying yes or no, the simple answer is I don't know, because these are all lie in the realm of unknowables for me. I don't know. So
it's an answer more people should be brave enough to give, I think. We're sort of culturally tuned to say yes or no, but most often the best answer is I don't know.
I don't know. There's no definitive way for me to know. And here I think, well, religion would say take a leap of faith and go one way or another. And this is again where I think, it's and here I take a leap of faith and say I don't know. I stick with that.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
I stick with that.
Faith in uncertainty.
That's right. But in terms of what distinguishes, if another way of putting the question is what distinguishes me as a Hindu from anyone else, I wouldn't say that there is anything, actually. I don't think there is fundamentally anything that distinguishes a Hindu from any other human being, whether they're practicing a particular form of religion, thinking, thought, secularism, or not. I just in being the only takeaway that I would take from Hinduism, and I don't think Hinduism is unique in any way, shape, or form from other religions or other forms of thinking in this respect, is the inherent divinity of all living beings. I'm willing to accept that. I fully accept that. Sentient and non-sentient, which is, plant life and trees. But they are alive. I don't know if they're sentient, but they are alive. And I'm happy, and I'm unhesitating, microbial activity. I'm actually willing to accept the inherent sacrality of those beings as well, though they may not be sentient. My only sort of caution would be to take this notion of sacrality into practice, because it harms sentient beings when we start practicing our sacrality on them in an objectifying way.
Yeah, brilliant.
In the way that institutional religion demands, that you build a temple to a cow, you build a temple to a living cow, you build a temple to a living child. That is where I have objections.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And you, of course, you answered, we've been talking about it already, but this sort of what matters question, but the who matters question, and you answered that there beautifully too. And I guess I'm a reasonably strict sentientist in that I tend to think that ultimately all value comes back to the experiences of sentient beings suffering, flourishing, and so on. So I draw a bit of a strong. So one, I'm quite open-minded about where that boundary is. We should be open-minded about plant sentience and follow the science, and oysters and bivalves and really simple animals. And so I'm quite open-minded about that, where that boundary is. And sentientism doesn't set a boundary; it just says take a naturalistic approach and use the science, right? But I'm reasonably strict about sentience being the only thing that matters. Now, where that leads me is that I do care about all of the other non-sentient life and the environment we all share. And, I have a rich environmental concern, but in a way that's, for me, it's more instrumental because I care about those things because of their impact on the sentient beings.
Yes.
Whereas yours goes more generously than that to, I think, to almost intrinsically seeing it. So if we were completely confident that a plant wasn't sentient, couldn't suffer, and didn't have its own experience, because it's living, you would see an intrinsic value in that living entity, even if there's no other sentient beings around it. If we imagine a planet with just plant life and rocks and rivers, but there's no sentient being will ever see it or experience it, you'd see some intrinsic value there. Whereas I wouldn't want to destroy it anyway, right? Why would we do that? Or why vandalize things? But I wouldn't see any intrinsic value in that planet if there was zero sentience. It feels like you go beyond that.
I'm aligned with your thinking to a significant extent, because I would also be instrumental in seeing the value of plant life as in terms of their worth to other animals. As I said, when we started living with chickens, I suddenly realized, oh my God, I shouldn't and I cannot clear my garden of weeds anymore, right? Because I see this plant as a weed. For the chicken, that's really valuable food. It's so political. I can't just pluck out weeds as I would previously. So they're not weeds. They don't.
And weeds is a somewhat arbitrary social construct anyway. So we can just reclassify them.
It's a racial construct in the plant world, really.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It's a blatantly racial and discriminatory construct in the plant world. It's a very deeply politically problematic term to call someone a weed, because a weed means they're inherently disposable.
Yeah.
Right.
Invasive species.
Exactly. Like urban planners have talked about the garden state, where some are plants and flowers to be preserved, and then the rest are weeds that you take out. Like city beautification has proceeded on the idea of the city as a garden state, where you pull out the weeds, where you pull out the poor people. The poor people are disposable; they can be thrown out. Certain forms of non-human life are also disposable to the city, to the urban life, and they can be pulled out. So the idea of the weed is very political. But going back to your original question about seeing the inherent value of plant life. So certainly, I'm very
are the chickens harming those plants by eating them? I guess that's another way of asking the question. Is that a morally negative thing for the chickens to be doing?
Because chickens and I share that quality of eating plants. And as the neurobiological system of plants is so different from a mammal or a bird or other forms of animal life. And therefore, I don't feel hesitation in allowing myself or the chickens to eat plants as they will. And that's
often part of the plant's life cycle in itself anyway. That's often how plants propagate themselves. But so I don't know if that's an excuse, but...
Yes, that is exactly true. They do have that is part of the system of propagation, and I share the instrumental view that if it helps the chickens live flourishing lives, go for it. But I would also see inherent value beyond that as well. If there was a planet full of trees and there was no other living being, that would be fine. That would be sufficient. I don't necessarily take the view that there has to be an instrumental or utilitarian value to non-sentient living life. I think it is important in some ways that we maintain that view, because we need to sort of, I think, divest ourselves of trying to put value onto everything. If there is no value, and we still see, if there is no usable value, if there is no instrumental or utilitarian value attached to a living being, I think it's actually really critical to still see value in them inherently, because
there's a danger in instrumentalization, isn't there? It's because it's quite often quite a naive, selfish instrumentalization. I think you could have a really generous instrumentalization that appreciates the rich interdependencies and things we don't understand and things we can't see, or you can have a really sort of selfish, narrow instrumentalization, which turns into a just destroy anything for marginal benefit to me.
That's right, because I think what worries me about human beings is that we are so easily given to extraction, and we are also able to collectivize extraction. We are able to institutionalize it. We are able to do it very thoroughly, systematically, and very efficiently. We are very good at extracting. So I think to develop that quality of being able to see value without feeling any compulsion to extract is actually a good thing. Whether I'm extracting on behalf of myself or my chicken or another animal, to be able to appreciate without extraction is, I think, an important quality for human beings to cultivate, just given our tendency to extract so efficiently. Yeah.
Now, one of the other risks with a more expansive moral scope, if you like, than sentience is, I think there are many people, and I'd include you in this, and I'd probably include me in it, that are sort of open-minded about whether we should go further in a genuine way, right? So we fully grant moral consideration to sentient beings. We appreciate the perspective of the other. We recognize their suffering, their flourishing, their will to live as deeply important things. So that's for the sentient beings. But we're open-minded about going further than that. But there's a couple of dangers, I think. One is the sort of obvious Twitter troll example of someone saying, well, plants can suffer too, because I read an article in some magazine that said carrots scream. So cutting a pig and cutting a carrot are morally equivalent. So I'm going to have another burger, right? So that's one stance, which is disingenuous and not well-founded. And they ultimately don't care about either. But they're using that as a pretense, right? Because when you have a conversation about, oh yeah, actually the idea of plant sentience and ethics is really interesting, and let's talk about the implications of that, and you do realize that gives you even more reasons to go vegan, we know where that conversation is. So let's put those people to one side because they're trolling. but there is I think another risk, and this isn't as disingenuous, of a sort of ethical flattening. And you can find this comes through quite a lot of religious worldviews, but it can come through a sort of a generous idea of spirituality, and it can even come through some forms of environmentalism, where you go to the sense of, someone will say to me, well, look, Jamie, you're too focused on sentient beings. Actually, rocks, rivers, trees, plants, the earth as an ecosystem matters. Everything matters, and every entity within that matters, which feels very generous. But then there is a risk of some sort of flattening where you've lost the salience of sentience itself, so that people, they're not the Twitter trolls, right, talking about the screaming carrots, but they sort of almost end up in a similar place where they say everything matters, it's all interconnected, there are these circles of life, humans shouldn't be arrogant to disconnect ourselves from nature, we should play our part in these circles of life, and consumption of other living beings is regretful, but it's something we should all play our part, and we're at the apex of the food chain. And ultimately they come to the same place and say, give me another Big Mac and a milkshake. So I should stop ranting, right? But how do we avoid that danger of a sort of ethical flattening that sounds nice, everything matters, but then the poor old sentient beings end up being, exploited and brutalized in that context?
Exactly. No, that worldview really worries me, and it is something which does come up in Hinduism. It comes up in I think all religions probably, comes up in indigenous worldviews as well, about the inherent sacrality of all cosmos. Stones, rivers, mountains are all inherently sacred. In Hinduism, we have strong traditions of mountain worship, river worship, worshipping lots of physical landscapes. Now, let me restrict myself to Hinduism here, because that is just the context that I know really well. It is not just animals, or it's not just sentient living beings who suffer when sacralized. Rivers, mountains, all suffer enormous ecological degradation when they're sacralized, when they're objectified in this way, right? Take the river Ganga, for example. One of the most polluted rivers, one of the most sacred rivers of India. The Yamuna River and the Ganga River are some of the most sacred rivers of India. And they are amongst the most polluted, to the extent that many river experts think they're dead. These rivers are fundamentally dead. There is really no, and there's millions and billions of dollars poured into revitalizing these rivers.
While being worshipped. Yeah.
While being worshipped. One of the major reasons for the river pollution, some of it is industrial, but huge amounts of it is just purely religious. There's a huge amount of religious waste that is going into these rivers. These rivers have been brutalized as well. Mountain ecologies have suffered because of the huge amounts of traffic, pilgrim traffic, religious traffic around them. So it's not to say that non-sentient natural landscapes do well or flourish. We have a huge tradition of sacred groves in India. We have no forest left. Right? Emma Tomalin, she's an academic based in the UK. She's written this book called Biodivinity and Biodiversity, I think. And she basically raises the same question in the context of the environment. If Hinduism regards the environment with such high veneration, then why does India have some of the most degraded environments in the world? Right? So this whole idea of the cosmos, the nature, the rivers, the stones, the oceans, all of them being sacred is also one that we should approach equally carefully, because it sounds, the cow is a mother sounds nice. Most people are shocked to hear about the status of cows in India. They actually think Indian dairy farming is the exemplar. I've heard so many people say Indian dairy farming is exemplar because the idea of cows as sacred or cow as mother sounds nice. The sacrality of the interconnected nature also sounds nice, but the reality always shows something different.
And let's come on to that. So the final question we like to ask is how can we make a better future? And that's another crazily big question, but we sort of go, well, if we understand reality in a certain way and we care about a certain range of beings or entities, and okay, how do we make things better for those entities, right? So we could go anywhere here in terms of utopian visions, the challenges of interhuman relations, the links between religion and politics, and discrimination and casteism and so on. But I guess the best place to start would be to pick up that story. And I think your diagnosis of the problem of the sacred and being worshipped is absolutely fascinating. And I hadn't thought about taking it even beyond sentient beings too, because a naive reading of it is, look, wouldn't it be nice to be worshipped, right? Wouldn't it be nice to be thought of as sacred? It's like people thinking you're the most important thing in the world. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? But as you've made crystal clear in almost every instance, actually what's happening is your perspective is not being taken into account. This is not an empathic or a sympathetic or a compassionate stance. Your perspective is not really involved here. You're being taken and objectified and then often controlled and sometimes even destroyed as you're being worshipped.
The relationship of domination and control. So in my book, I talk about the framing of the cow as mother is one of domination and control. You control and dominate the cow when you call her a mother. So
can you summarize the book in 5 minutes for us? Sorry, but it's such a brilliant example, because I think you can frame it by saying, look, people who don't know much about India will probably think, well, the Hindu religion sees cows as sacred, and then you will tell them about the scale and the intensity of the Indian beef, dairy, and leather industries, and someone will go, how can that be? And I guess that's your answer to this is centered around the idea of what sacredness means and what its implications are. But yeah, how would you sort of lay out that story for us?
Well, my curiosity that led to this book initially started in 2014 when the Hindu right came to power for the first time in independent India, and they assumed power at the center. And at the same time, in 2014, and they started to mobilize cow protection as one of their major electoral agendas. The cow is our mother, as in the mother of Hindus, and those who butcher the cow, Muslims, are committing a crime basically against Hindus as well, right? And they do not belong to the Hindu state, because if you belong to the Hindu state, you must revere the cow as your mother.
And for people outside of India, they may assume that these messages were background, subliminal, implied, hinted at, but are they actually that explicit?
It was actually that explicit. In 2014, it became literally that explicit, because butchers who are frequently Muslims or of so-called lower castes, right? Scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, they were the former, in quotes, untouchables of Indian society, the Dalits. they were frequently at they're frequently the butchers, right? And it's same in India as in any other society. The poorest, the most marginalized, the most vulnerable are the ones that take on butchering jobs because who else wants them, right? So it was the same in India. The political economy of bovine production in India, which is basically dairy production in India, the slaughter end of dairy production in India is populated by Muslims and Dalits, right? So they were, and they always have been some of the main butchers of cows as well as other animals. And so when the Hindu right came into power, there was suddenly a resurgence of lynching, killing, raping, beating of members of these communities who were accused of killing the cow and implicitly trying to kill Mother India, because the cow is a stand-in for the mother nation itself, right? So basically, I started to probe. My curiosity was about, what happens. I just wanted to understand the realities of the cows themselves and basically what happens in India. So basically that led me to the dairy industry, because India does not have a beef industry. And this puzzle about how does India become the largest beef producer in the world, a country where some about 25 states have a ban on cow slaughter.
Yeah,
we don't have a national ban on cow slaughter. We do not have a national ban on cow slaughter. Nepal is the only country that has a national ban on cow slaughter, right? India actually doesn't, because India is a secular republic. So technically speaking, we cannot have a national ban on cow slaughter, but every state is allowed to enact its own sort of bans, and many states have, most of the states have. So it doesn't actually add up that a country that actually has such significant bans on cow slaughter, where it is so heavily regulated, becomes the world's leading producer of beef. And I wanted to understand this puzzle, right? And one way of explaining it is that the Indian beef sector is largely composed of water buffaloes, which is true to a significant extent, but that is not the complete story. That is not the complete story. Basically, what happens in India...
water buffaloes aren't thought of as cows in that context. And my understanding is there are different breeds of cows, and some of them don't qualify either, is that?
Exactly. So it's only the native Indian cows that really are considered to be sacred cows. Now, this again is not something that the Constitution says. The Constitution does recommend that, there should be a ban on cow slaughter, but it can't enforce it. It doesn't state that it should be. It recommends that this would be an ideal. But it makes no differentiation about the breeds of cows that must be saved. This is something that on the ground, when you translate a national ban on cow slaughter or a ban on cow slaughter per se, in a country that's also producing dairy, that's also breeding cows for dairy, you've got to be able to interpret this law in some way which is feasible, which basically means that you have to make some cows not sacred. These are the foreign breeds. These are what they call the American breeds, the Holsteins, the Jerseys, as well as the crossbreeds that are crossbred with the native Indian breeds. These are all, considered to be not sacred. So a lot of gaushalas, which are cow shelters, will only accept native Indian cows, for example, into their cow shelters. And everyone else, what happens to everyone else? This is the real story, right? So in every other country that produces dairy, including the leading dairy producers, whether it's Australia, whether it's the United States, or whether it's the European Union, it's very clear that dairy cows eventually end up in the slaughterhouse. In India, somehow this is disrupted. In India, somehow cows are bred for dairy. They go through the cycle of dairy production. You have your infertile cows, you have your diseased cows, you have your male bulls, you have male calves. You have a significant members, in other words, of the bovine family who are not lactating, who are not producing milk, same as what happens in every other country. Somehow in India, though, the story goes that these animals are not slaughtered. What happens then? Supposedly, gaushalas, which are cow shelters, receive them. We all know that no animal sanctuary, no animal shelter, however well-intentioned, however well-resourced, is completely incapable of fully absorbing the dairy industry. We all know that. So what happens in India is that the dairy production continuum, which in every other country is, they go through the cycle of dairy production, and then the continuum ends up in the slaughterhouse. In India, what happens is that cow slaughter simply goes underground. So we actually have the largest industrialized scale of, when I say industrialized, I just mean the scale of it. We have the largest scale of cow slaughter anywhere in the world. It's completely underground. There is no other way for India to sustain itself as a dairy producing country.
So the way that you resolve this tension between the sacredness of the cow and the existence of the industry is by hiding the slaughter, and also at the same time condemning and attacking the people who are involved in the slaughter and declaring them as beyond the pale.
Exactly, because there is two things that is going on here. On the one hand, cows and cow milk is central to the Hindu identity. Consumption of cow milk is central to the Hindu identity. Milk, butter, and ghee are all considered to be very sacred in ritual Hinduism, right? So they are considered to be very sacred in ritual Hinduism.
Because they've come from the sacred mother.
They come from the sacred mother. They're used in sweets. They are very, very strongly linked to the Hindu identity.
And the mother sustains us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you need dairy to sort of fully compose the Hindu identity, but you have to distance yourself from the slaughter. That goes underground. Now, the slaughter is the political economy of slaughter in India is such that they are done by Muslims. They are done by so-called low-caste Hindus. Okay? So it is very easy in the construction of the Hindu state, while using the cow, you get to use the cow and vulnerable labor associated with the cow to construct the Hindu state 2 times. One is in the dairy industry, and the second time is you get to use it again. You get to use the cow again at the time of slaughter by condemning her slaughter while celebrating her milk, while the two are intertwined.
Yeah, and it's another example of so many where different forms of oppression mutually reinforce each other and overlap. And
yeah. So you have a case of genuinely clashing or conflicting vulnerabilities, because on the one hand, the cow in India is as vulnerable to the extractions of dairying as anywhere else in the world. In fact, even more so, because you will not find cows eating plastic and toxic waste the way they do in India. The cows are abandoned, they're street, the ones that are roaming around on the streets are abandoned cows, 60 kilos, 70 kilos, 80 kilos of plastic in their abdomen. And we can't even begin to fathom what it means for a cow to consume plastic, because they have 4 chambers in their stomachs. The agony that they go through, because the plastic doesn't go through the 4 chambers. It results in innumerable blockages. I have seen cows in these prolonged processes of dying. It is very difficult to euthanize a cow in India. Euthanasia per se is rarely done in India, but it becomes highly political to euthanize a cow in India. So they just die abject, prolonged deaths. So a cow remains vulnerable, not just to dairying, but to the unique conditions of dairying in India, particularly, where they're underfed, they're over-extracted, they're subjected to, oxytocin injections for greater milk extraction, they're eating garbage, they're eating toxic garbage. So they are vulnerable to all of these conditions. And at the same time, there's a clashing vulnerability, because the butchers who slaughter the cows are also vulnerable to the extractions this time of the Hindu state.
I find it fascinating. We talked about this briefly before as well, because this is a particular context in given where India is today politically, with Hindu nationalism and the themes we've talked about here. But it also seems to echo some of the links between nationalist modes of thinking and the way we think about non-human animals and animal agriculture in other parts of the world as well. So, a classic example that certainly feels like it's coming through in the US and in the UK is an association between particularly the far-right nationalists, who make it really explicit, and the role of animal agriculture. And there the rationale is a bit different, because they don't worship cows or any other animals, but they and I think it, whereas the I'm going to radically oversimplify here, but in a Hindu context, it's more about an expansive, as you said, we're all part of an interconnected whole, and we can worship, and we worship the cow as our mother, and then we will exploit extract and harm through that worship. Whereas in the Western mode, it's a little bit more, again, an echo of a sort of Christian or Abrahamic view, which is more deliberately anthropocentric. So it's much more, we have dominion and the earth is here for us, and ultimately humans are the point of the universe. And we're going to be very proud at putting that into practice. And then that links to themes of, one of the driving forces of colonialism was the need for more land for animal agriculture. There are some quite odd patterns of behavior where some on the far right have come to see their tolerance for lactose as a marker of their racial supremacy, and will, chug quarts of milk as a sign of pride that, they as Aryans have evolved sufficiently to be able to. So there's all sorts of, and then there's the classic might makes right and, will to power and a comfort oppressing others, and my freedom is so important that it even allows me to harm others, that classic extreme far right mindset. But there is also that link to, as you talked about before, where I think maybe there's more a direct parallel, where that very socially conservative mindset thinks about women in a way that echoes what you talked about before, where there is this sense of, women are worshipped and they're special, but you have to fit in your traditional role as a wife and a mother, and this is what you do. And again, it feels similar. You sort of put on a pedestal, oh, isn't that nice? But actually you're being controlled and exploited and restricted and often oppressed. So I'm going on too long, but it's really interesting that from very different cultural backdrops, you can still see some sort of similar echoes feeding through.
Oh, very similar. So in the use of cows, Hinduism is as anthropocentric as in the Abrahamic religions, because sacralization is anthropocentrism.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Right? It is absolutely an anthropocentric way of relating to another animal. If you think about who is sacralized, it is actually always the most vulnerable subjects. It is animals, it is women, it is children, it is nature, where we can have dominion and control over nature, right? So because anthropocentrism stratifies along human and non-human lines as well. It is not just related to human oppression of non-humans, it also relates to human oppression of other vulnerable humans and nature itself. So anthropocentrism is about an idealized human, whether it is the white male, whether it is the Brahmin male, whether it is the Brahmin female for that matter, right? It is an idealized, privileged, racialized, casteized human that gets to sort of be the exemplar human, and all the other subcategories of humans, which might be women, which might be children, which might be people of other religions, castes, etc., but also includes the non-human world. So anthropocentrism, manifesting as worship, manifesting as sacralization, is very much an act of domination and control, which I think is equally shared by Hinduism as with the Abrahamic religions. It's an extractive model. Sacralization is an extractive model.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'd sum that up by saying, if someone offers you the choice of being considered sacred and worshipped, or just being an object of compassion where others care about you because of your own perspective, pick option B. Definitely pick option B. Yeah. Now, in this final question, we're talking about how to make a better future. So you've laid out a sort of fascinating diagnosis of a situation. I'm going to ask you, is there a way forward here? Because in the sort of classic, in the US, the UK, and Europe, when we're thinking about the problem about sentient animal agriculture, more and more people are seeing it as an issue. We see the ethical issues, we see the environmental issues, to some degree we see human health issues, but the story is somewhat simple, right? So the story here is the animal agriculture industries are very powerful, but actually they're quite small. There's a percentage of the people involved in those industries is quite small. So if we can reduce demand by ultimately everyone going vegan, and if we can help those industries transition to plant agriculture or environmental rebuilding or some other, less harmful way of life, then that will be the answer. And we'll end up we'll have transitioned our industries to plant-based systems. We'll have new technical fixes with plant-based meats and cultivated meats as well for the people who, laggards and won't come across to just eat vegetables. And then that's the answer, right? That's how we'll work, where it'll be a just transition. We'll transition those industries, demand down, some new technical fixes, switch across, and we're done.
Yeah.
India, as you've already made clear, has a very different context, partly because the proportion of people involved in animal agriculture is much, much larger as a percentage of the population. And it has a very different character in that sense. But the cultural context you've talked about is also radically different too. So sort of simplistic notions of how we might like to run a just transition in the US just don't apply, I don't think. But so how do you think about the possibility for positive change? And if we did imagine a utopian vision where there was an end to the exploitation, harming, and killing of non-human animals, what could that path possibly look like in the Indian context?
So this is I've been thinking about this question a lot through the writing of my book, right? Like, so what happens next? We all know that, I've just shown you how terribly cows are abused in India. What's next? And my inspiration for what's next is actually India's dairy industry, right? So in the 1950s, when India had just gained independence and India was still impoverished and India was still food insecure, and we were still importing food as well as milk from the West, one of the ways in which food security was India's biggest priority post-independence. And one of the ways to achieve this was to strengthen not just plant-based farming, but, one of the innovations, this was considered to be literally an innovation, was to revitalize dairy farming in some way, right? So dairy farming in India was instituted as a poverty alleviation program. It had nothing to do with nutrition. It had nothing to do with cultural imperatives, because India is not actually traditionally a dairy consuming country. We are the largest dairy consumer and producer now. But dairy farming in India was instituted in the 1970s as a poverty alleviation program. And it was all centered around the emancipation of farmers. And to that extent that it did that, it's actually the world's largest poverty alleviation program. It is the most successful in scale. It's the largest poverty alleviation program in the world. And this has happened in a very quick and rapid period of about 50, 60 years. It's happened really quickly, right? So this is what gives me hope, is prioritizing the farmer's needs. The farmers weren't naturally wanting to produce dairy. They weren't, farmers were, the industry was heavily subsidized, so heavily subsidized that, the state was sort of, undertook an obligation to buy every last drop of milk that the farmers produced. So the farmers' income was assured, right? We have a glut of milk in the country now, which is now dehydrated as milk powder. But India has an hugely excess amount of milk. I think virtually all dairy producing countries have an excess amount of milk, which is dehydrated as powder to be used, to be, mixed with water again when needed, etc. So this makes me, so I've been thinking about this, and I just think the pathway forward is to put the farmer first, and subsidize the farmer and support and support the farmers, but these can be done really thoughtfully. Like, for example, cashew farmers in India. Cashew farming is one of the most is an industry rife with human rights abuses and child rights abuses. There's a lot of child labor that is used in cashew farming in India, right? How about heavily subsidizing the cashew industry and really cleaning up the cashew industry, making cashew farming to be so attractive and sustainable, for example, that farmers are encouraged? Because that's how dairy farming took off. Jackfruit farming, for example, gluts and gluts of jackfruit used to go to waste annually in India, until veganism took off in the West and jackfruit farmers could suddenly export all this sort of wasted jackfruit, that was going to waste in India. They could export it to the West now. They had a sudden resurgence of income, right? So it is actually possible to do this exactly the way dairy farming did it, which is to place the farmer first. To place the farmer at the center of everything would actually make the biggest difference. So it is actually about subsidizing all of these plant-based imperatives. Instead, what is happening is that all the animal industries are being subsidized to the extent that animal-based products are actually much cheaper. It's a source of enormous shame in India that chicken is cheaper than lentils in India now. It's because of the way that the poultry industry, the chicken industry is so heavily subsidized. So heavily subsidized as compared to the legumes and beans and that India is actually known for. Right. But this is not natural. This is not a natural outcome. This is a political outcome. This is an outcome of a carefully designed political economy. That can be changed. That can be changed only by putting the farmer first and providing subsidies very carefully to particular industries that will allow this.
Yeah, thank you. So put the farmer first. And India's already shown it can do this sort of transition, but now it just needs to transition to a plant-based economy instead, and you have confidence that it could be done. And I guess the challenge then becomes one of points of view and worldviews and political will. What do you think are the most effective messages there, and how hopeful are you that they might play through? So the sorts of examples, of course, include the conversations around human health, which we need to be evidence-based. We shouldn't overclaim, but there's some stories there. There's clearly the environmental imperative, whether it's emissions and land use and pollution and, zoonosis and the other stories in that context too, which obviously have a bearing on India and Indian politicians. Do you think there is also a path around the non-human animal ethics as well? Is there a way to engage with people about what the implications of sacredness should mean? Can you have a conversation that says, if you worship the cow, if you see the cow as your mother, look at the harms these industries are doing, can we convert the worship into compassion somehow? How do you think about those messages?
Yeah, this actually takes me back to what you had said, I think, earlier in the conversation about would you prefer to be objective, sacralized, or would you prefer to be the subject of compassion? And in India's constitution, I think it's one of the first in the world again to basically state that every Indian citizen has a fundamental duty to be compassionate to other animals. We actually have that in the constitution.
It's pretty progressive on the animal front, isn't it? Yeah.
We have a fundamental duty. Every Indian citizen has a fundamental duty to be compassionate, to show compassion. I mean, to all living creatures and especially other animals. And when I was looking at the etymology of compassion, it actually means co-suffering. Right? It's actually co-suffering. So the Indian constitution is actually asking us to co-suffer with other animals, which is very different from sacralization, which is an act of domination, which is an act of control. So when we were talking earlier about what is the difference between observation and witnessing, and when I said it's about allowing oneself to be vulnerable, compassion requires that. Compassion demands that. If I'm compassionate to another living being, it also demands in turn that I am vulnerable to what being compassionate means. There's a certain vulnerability to being compassionate, right? So whether these modes of thinking can find their way into into ways that translate into the political economy, I would very much like to think that yes, it would. And again, I want to sort of fall back on what has worked in India, in the context of India previously. What has worked in the context of India previously? With the independence movement, with the Indian independence movement, for example, what worked then? There was again a mass mobilization. What were the elements of that mass mobilization, and can we translate that into remobilizing again for the cause of non-human animals? And Mahatma Gandhi, in his sort of talks about ahimsa, non-violence, commitment to truth. Can we find ways of embodying all of that again, or does it require a charismatic leader? And I think it is actually not that absurd to think that there is actually a need for a charismatic leader. We haven't got that yet for non-human animals in quite the same powerful way. We don't have a Nelson Mandela. We don't have a Mahatma Gandhi. We don't have a Martin Luther King for animals. And I think that is actually a really significant gap. That's a massively significant gap. We don't have someone who will sacrifice and show and embody in a really in such a powerfully visceral way. We don't have that. And I think the impact of a charismatic but not just charismatic, someone who has actually gone beyond most of humanity to live these ideals, to sacrifice for these ideals, to suffer for these ideals. That the value is not to be understated. I think there's immense value in that, there's importance in that. We haven't got that. And I think we need a leader. We need lots of leaders to emerge in the way that Mahatma Gandhi did, in the way that Nelson Mandela did, Martin Luther King did. We need these ideals to sort of, these sorts of personalities to reemerge, because I think most movements have sort of in some ways gathered around these sorts of figureheads historically. I don't think that's different today either.
Yeah, and it feels like the raw materials are there, the potential is there, right? It's already in the Constitution, it's already in the ideas of ahimsa, it's already, you know, the backdrop and the capability is there, but you feel like you need some charismatic leadership to really crystallize it and pull it together. And
we need some sort of charismatic leadership, and it's very, you know, I mean, the world has changed. We are suspicious of charismatic leaders now. We are suspicious, and we are right to be suspicious of charismatic leaders. We know that charismatic leaders can do a lot of harm. We have living examples of that all over the planet today. Oh, yeah. Right? So we know the great potential of harm, and we are right to be suspicious of them. But I think we also intuitively will recognize a great leader when one comes along.
Yeah. Are you available, by the way?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that was brilliant. Thank you. And a hopeful answer as well. I know things feel tough at the moment, but there's so much positive potential there. So there's some hope as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, we need to think that. We need to believe that too. Yes.
Yeah, we do. So I will let you go and relax into your evening. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me. And yeah, I mean, I just share that hope that, you know, the ideas of ahimsa, the ideas of compassion and co-suffering, and also in the political realm, the importance of democracy and secularism that India is rightly so proud of, continue to shape the nation going forward. Yeah, so let's hope.
Oh, that would be the most hopeful sort of vision I have for the future. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful country. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. That was such a pleasure to talk to you. What's the best way of people following you, reading your book, of course, learning more about your work, you know, plugging into your new Twitter account now you've been allowed back on?
Yeah, I have a new Twitter account because I deactivated my other Twitter account for so long. I lost my Twitter account. So I've got a new baby Twitter account at Yamini Narayanan. You might be able to follow me there if you wish. And my university website is probably the best way of finding my updated work, because that's very regularly updates my publications. So, which would be my profile page on the Deakin University website. Yeah,
cool. I'll include the links in the show notes so people can click through. Well, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. And please do stay in touch. It's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really enjoyed our conversation as well.
Take care.